The Supreme Court of Canada ruled against three provinces that have conservative governments yesterday on carbon pricing, ruled that the federal legislation is constitutional. And both those three premiers and the Conservative Party of Canada leader, Erin O'Toole, have come under some criticism for not having a policy or position on carbon pricing. And so we're going to talk to economist Michael Bernstein of Canadians for Clean Prosperity about what a conservative climate policy, maybe, on carbon pricing could look like. So, Michael, welcome to the interview.
Always good to talk to you, Markham.
Well, look, I know your position on carbon pricing, so I'm sure that you're thrilled about the decision yesterday. So, what would, if you were a policy advisor to premiers Kenney in Alberta, Ford in Ontario, Moe in Saskatchewan, or CPC leader Erin O'Toole, what would you advise them?
Look, I think for the conservative premiers in particular, this is actually an opportunity, perhaps in disguise, because given that the court has now decided that their court case was not valid, they actually have the perfect excuse to pivot, right? Because they can tell their constituents quite legitimately, I did everything I could here to try to get rid of this tax. But now my choice is either to accept this tax imposed by Ottawa or to reclaim money to our province and design a policy that works better for our citizens. And so to answer your question directly, I think that each province actually has a range of options here. The one that I would most like to see, and the one we polled the most extensively, and it is a popular one, is to reduce income taxes as part of a carbon tax program. So increase carbon taxes, reduce income taxes. It's classic conservative principle, small c conservative principle, in fact. And we see that in polling, it's actually quite a popular policy with conservative voters.
Now, we should point out that the BC Liberals, which is really the Conservative Party in BC, brought in exactly that kind of tax carbon tax in 2007. We refer to it generally as revenue neutral. You raise carbon pricing, you put a levy on, and then you lower other taxes so that it's revenue neutral. And I've never understood why the premiers, even Rachel Notley in Alberta, didn't do that, and that seems to be the most politically palatable by a mile.
Yeah, look, as I say, we see that it's very popular with conservative voters, and it's not clear to me why more conservative premiers haven't taken that up. Frankly, I think that what's happened is that most conservative elected leaders have been more concerned about saying a policy of my opponent is a policy I oppose, rather than thinking about how can we actually apply a conservative principle. I'm hopeful that you're going to see more premiers come out with that kind of solution, but you could see other things too, right? You could see different forms of the rebate. You could see what actually Scott Moe already suggested he might do yesterday, which is try to reduce other fuel taxes instead to compensate for the increased cost of a carbon tax. And that would be, from a climate perspective at least, not an ideal policy.
Well, here's another maybe not so ideal policy, and that's the one that Erin O'Toole and Jason Kenney have talked about, and that is they would prefer to see carbon pricing apply to industrial emitters on the business side, but not on the consumer side. And the problem with that, of course, is that why would you want to tax the industries that create your jobs?
I think there's a few problems. Yeah, I think there's a few problems with it. I mean, that's clearly one challenge. I'd say another challenge, particularly for Erin O'Toole, is that he has been very clear, rightfully so, I think, that he wants to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Well, guess what? Industrial emitters, while an important part of the problem, are about 30% of emissions. So you're not going to be able to get to net zero on the back of 30% of emissions. And even if you were trying to do, or say, make initial progress there, you're going to, as you say, have to impose very high costs there and risk jobs and economic activity.
And it seems to me rather odd that the Conservatives are so dug in on this, in that Preston Manning of the Reform Party and sort of the grandfather of modern Canadian conservative economic policy, really was one of the first to promote carbon pricing back
Yeah.
in the 1990s. And it should be an easy pivot to go back. Well, maybe not an easy one, but they should be able to do it given that kind of history amongst conservative thinkers.
I would think so too. And I'll tell you that, look, I personally, and Clean Prosperity as an organization shares a lot of the underlying philosophy that has led to maybe some hesitancy initially around carbon pricing, which is to say that I totally respect some of these conservative leaders' concern about the costs that households face. The reality that, say, rural residents, for example, often have fewer choices than urban residents when it comes to things like public transit. So those kind of, and on, the concerns about farmers. So there's legitimate concerns here, right? And those are coming from, I think, a good place. But the key here is let's look at policy solutions that can best address that. And if you're starting from a point that we ought to have climate policy that is the lowest cost we can and the most affordable for citizens, you get to the place that Preston Manning got and many others have gotten, including us, which is carbon pricing is really your best option.
Where do you stand on this issue of carbon pricing plus other policies, particularly industrial policy? And we interviewed Professor Danny Cullenward from Stanford about his new book, Making Climate Policy Work, in which he argued that yes, carbon pricing, but you need a whole host of other policy levers in order to really effectively bring down greenhouse gas emissions. And that kind of, if it seems to me that if premiers embraced all of the policy options available to them, they could design policies that might be able to offset some of those concerns about rural residents or other those kinds of things. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say absolutely it's the case that carbon pricing should be the centerpiece of a climate policy, but not the whole piece, that we need other policy for sure. And in our analysis, carbon pricing does about half the job to get us to net zero. That's really important, but you've got to address the other half. Now, I think that, and I've heard you when you talk to Danny, and I've heard him elsewhere too, and I think his argument is essentially the biggest challenge with carbon pricing is political, is that you often don't have robust policies because it gets watered down through the political process. The good news here is that Canada seems to be ahead of the curve on this. We actually do have a robust policy strengthened by the court decision yesterday. And it really now depends on one more thing, which is how the conservative premiers and the federal leader respond. I'm hopeful that in the end, they will find a path to their own policy on carbon pricing.
Michael, thank you very much. Insightful as always.
Great to talk to you.